But I got some bad news for you. You're probably one as well. Whenever I heard the words addiction or addict, the first thing that popped into my head was an image of a bum living on the street while being high on drugs. That was the impression that was imprinted in my childhood, and it's the reason why for the longest time I didn't consider myself to be an addict at all. If that's your perception of addiction, then you might think this topic doesn't concern you. But addiction can be found in other everyday behaviors that nobody would bat an eye for if you were to indulge in them, such as shopping, browsing the internet, eating fast food, working, scrolling on your phone, drinking coffee, gambling, playing RuneScape. You get the point. It's not exclusive to alcoholics and drug users. So what I'm going to talk about today is relevant to everyone because I believe most of us are addicted to something, even if we might not know or want to admit it. At the very least, we all have certain behaviors that we would like to stop or reduce. And to improve your life, you don't have to necessarily add a ton of new habits, but rather eliminate the ones that are holding you down. Of course, most of the behaviors I mentioned are acceptable when done in moderation. Someone who gets drunk every once in a while is not necessarily an addict. He's merely making a bad choice. What addiction really is continued and compulsive overconsumption that you continue to indulge in despite the negative consequences you experience yourself or you're inflicting onto others. So if you keep repeating a behavior and you can't reduce or stop it, you are an addict. But the problem is that the most common thing an addict tells himself is that he's not really addicted, that he can stop at any time, and that he just doesn't want or doesn't see a reason to stop. Rather, he finds ways to justify his behavior. So a good question to ask yourself is this: can you stop that behavior completely for a few weeks? Can you do without your phone, sugar, coffee, or your computer for that period of time? If we're completely honest, for a lot of us the answer is no. And we might want to examine more closely as to why that is. Because the easiest way to take control over your behavior is to understand why you're doing it in the first place. We all have certain desires. And our addiction, while it may be problematic, is usually just a solution we have come up with to fulfill those desires. You see, if our behavior didn't benefit us in some way, we wouldn't be repeating it. In other words, we're addicted to our drug of choice because it fulfills a certain purpose. For some people, it's pleasure-seeking. Obviously, we all want to feel good. Maybe you want to feel the excitement of discovering something new, so you go on the internet and browse social media. Or perhaps you want to have some fun, so you look to entertain yourself by sports betting or playing video games. However, our behavior isn't only driven by our desires, but also by the problems and difficulties of life. So another reason behind our behavior is pain avoidance. And I believe that this is the more common behavioral driver for most people. Obviously, nobody wants to feel unpleasant. We want to escape that pain. So when you're stressed or overwhelmed, you binge on food or cigarettes to replace the bad feelings with good sensations. Perhaps you feel lonely or bored and you go shopping or gambling to take your mind off those depressing thoughts. Maybe you feel helpless or empty and you binge watch Netflix series all day in order to distract yourself. I could go on and on. But whether it's pleasure-seeking or pain avoidance, you've probably noticed in your own life that you tend to rely on highly dopaminergic behaviors or substances as your solution. Meaning, when you indulge in those activities, your brain releases a lot of dopamine. And as you may already know, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is linked to motivation, craving, and drive. Whenever it gets released, your mood tends to elevate and you feel great. But the more dopamine an activity releases and the faster it gets released, the more addictive it is. So you have to be really careful here. While this strategy of indulging in highly dopaminergic activities might be effective for elevating your mood in the short term, it can make your life worse in the long term. In her book, The Dopamine Nation, Anna Lembke, who's an addiction expert and professor at Stanford University, describes a very important process. She explains how pain and pleasure are actually processed in the same region of the brain, but more importantly, that they work like a balance. Which is something that I didn't know until recently, but is an absolutely crucial aspect to the way that we function in everyday life. Imagine that your brain contains a scale. When there's nothing on it, it's perfectly flat and balanced. However, when you indulge in a pleasurable, high dopamine activity, the balance tips. The more exciting the behavior, the more and faster it tips, the more pleasure you feel. But here's the thing about balance. It wants to remain level or flat. So every time it gets tipped towards pleasure, eventually a self-regulating mechanism that is not under your control kicks in order to bring it back to the level position it was in. However, it doesn't just stop at balance. Instead, the mechanism overcompensates and tips the scale all the way to the pain side for you to spend an equal time there as you did on the pleasure side. When this happens, you don't experience literal physical pain, but rather you might feel a sense of unease, like there's something missing. And what you feel are cravings for the thing that brought you that initial pleasure. You want to recreate that moment of enjoyment, or at the very least, try not to let it fade away. So what do? You push on the pleasure side again. You keep on scrolling, playing, watching, drinking, eating, or whatever you were doing. But there's a problem with that. When you try to recreate that previous high, that spike of pleasure, there are two key factors working against you. Firstly, there's something called diminishing marginal utility. You know how when you're hungry, the first slice of pizza tastes amazing? It's 10 out of 10. The second and the third one are still pretty good, but the sixth one is kinda meh. This happens with almost everything. The more you indulge in something, the less pleasure you derive from it. Secondly, over time, you build tolerance. If you're obsessively watching pornography, you will eventually require more extreme versions of it, otherwise it will stop being exciting. Or if you're a gambling addict, you'll feel the need to bet higher and higher amounts because lower amounts simply won't thrill you anymore. Your baseline will adjust and you'll require a more potent version. These two factors create a vicious cycle where you keep pressing on the pleasure side more and more while getting less and less pleasure from it. And if you keep giving into your cravings day after day, eventually you're not doing it for pleasure anymore. You're doing it just to feel normal, and you might not even realize it. Take a look at this graph here. It's another way to visualize the pain-pleasure balancing act that takes place. When you first indulge in instant gratification, you feel great due to a dopamine spike. But once the high wears off, it drops down and goes below the baseline. You feel a sense of unease and you crave more of your quote-unquote drug. So you indulge again, but by doing that, you're not letting the balance reset properly. Further indulgence then isn't as gratifying as it was at first due to diminishing marginal utility. But you don't want to stop, rather you want to recreate that high because of the cravings. So you keep using over and over and over, but you get to a point where you're no longer getting anything out of it, you're just using your drug to feel normal because you've developed tolerance and adapted. What used to make you feel good is now required for you to not feel terrible. And if you stop now, you'll have to face the withdrawal symptoms and feel irritated, distracted, anxious or empty. All because the self-regulating mechanism wants to collect the debt that you racked up from binging on highly dopaminergic activities. And I believe a lot of us are stuck in this pattern. We've become slaves to our cravings and we can't really control our behavior even if we think we can. So the big question is, how can we break this vicious cycle and take that control back?